Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimberly Chalia with PHCA. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, PHCA Political and Legislative Recap, and Where We Go From Here, presented by our very own Tim Ward. A few quick updates to share before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the PHCA website. The webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit for all attendees. For those who provided a NAB number, credits will be uploaded shortly. We'll also share certificates to those in attendance. As we begin today, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. Please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A icon on your screen, and we'll make sure to answer as many of those questions as possible at the end of today's presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me this morning in discussing a subject that, frankly, is the living and breathing thing that centers around what I do here in Harrisburg and Washington, D.C. on your behalf. So I do want to dive right in. We're going to cover the election results here in Harrisburg and in Washington, D.C. and talk a little bit about what happened and why it happened and what the results mean for our industry, and just looking ahead to 2023 and 2024, what are our priorities going to look like, and how these election results, frankly, will impact what we will be able to and won't be able to get done, what we'll be doing in terms of playing offense, in terms of advancing an agenda, and playing defense in terms of battling back legislation and regulation that, frankly, will harm our sector. So again, without further ado, just wanted to dive right in here. Obviously, we have our state capitol here in Harrisburg up on your left, and right center stage here is the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., home to really, the folks that ultimately determine how we operate, and ultimately, are instrumental in our successes, and also are responsible for correcting some of the challenges that are facing our sector. So want to level set first, starting here in Harrisburg, talking a little bit about the politics of Pennsylvania, and that really is who is our state government, and so we have 203 state representatives from communities across the Commonwealth. We have 50 state senators, and then we have down in Washington, D.C., we have our 18 U.S. representatives, members of Congress. As a note, due to congressional redistricting and the U.S. Census, we did lose a congressional seat. So beginning in 2023, we will only have 17 of those seats. We have 2 U.S. senators, Pat Toomey, who is retiring, and we'll get into that race in a second, and U.S. Senator Bob Casey, our senior senator and the current and future chairman of the Senate Aging Committee. Senator Casey, being in that position, has been very instrumental in allowing PHCA to influence long-term care policy in Washington, D.C. And we really have partnered with ACA many a times over the last 2 years to push the senator on policy that would benefit our sector, while also trying to combat harmful policy and regulations that the Biden administration is seeking on us as well. So Harrisburg, present day, we'll just start with a level set, Republicans versus Democrats. Currently, the Republicans hold the majority in both the state House and the state Senate. The Republicans have had the majority in the state House for the better part of a decade. Republicans control the state Senate as well, 28-21, with 1 independent who does caucus with the Republican Party. So it's really 29-21 in favor of the Republican Party. The Republicans have controlled the state Senate since the 1980s. And we have our outgoing governor, Tom Wolf, who's finishing up his last few months in office here. Over the last 8 years, obviously, we've had our challenges with the Wolf administration. We've had our successes with the Wolf administration. They are phasing out. We will have a brand new administration in just about 60 days. And then, of course, in Washington, D.C., present day, Democrats hold the majorities in both the U.S. House and the Senate. You can see slim majority in the House, tied in the U.S. Senate, but because President Biden's in the White House, Vice President Harris is, she presides over the U.S. Senate. So her role, really her number 1 role as vice president, is to break ties, and so she's had to break quite a few ties and therefore she is the 51st vote for the Democrats, giving them a 1-seat majority. And of course, we have our President Joe Biden, who is finishing up his 2nd year in office, and this is his first midterm election. And speaking of midterm elections, generally speaking, you know, the party that is in the White House usually fares the worst in midterm elections. So in terms of expectations, we would have expected to see last Tuesday that Republicans would have made gains in both chambers, both in Harrisburg and Washington, D.C., making it very difficult for Democrats to, in Harrisburg, try and retake both the House and the Senate, and in Washington, D.C., the same as well. So without further ado, just wanted to talk a little bit about what was at stake. In Harrisburg, on our ballots, 203 state house seats. So every member of the state house was up for re-election, and 25 seats in the state Senate. So we do every 2 years, there's 25 seats up. So we had 25 seats on the ballot on Tuesday. And then of course we had our gubernatorial election, which took a lot of oxygen, was the one of the 2 premier races here in Pennsylvania. And now down in Washington, D.C., similar to our state house, every member of the U.S. House was up for re-election, 438 seats, of which 17 are now from Pennsylvania, again, losing 1 seat, going down to 17, and 25 seats in the U.S. Senate were up, including our very own Pat Toomey seat. Senator Toomey announced very early on in 2021 that he would not seek re-election to the U.S. Senate. He will finish at the end of December, beginning of January, serving 2 full terms, 12 years as our U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. So between our gubernatorial election and our U.S. Senate election, obviously, you know, whether you watch TV or not, because they're getting onto our streaming services now too, we were really ground zero for political advertisements, you know, since Labor Day, but frankly, even before that, it's starting earlier and earlier. And 2 of the most expensive races in the entire country happened right here in Pennsylvania. So this is an image. You'll see, obviously, it's the red wave with the president. And as I mentioned, the party that is in power usually has significant challenges in a midterm election. And by all accounts, you know, prognosticators, political scientists, experts, me, I'm not an expert, but my expectation was as well that the Tuesday was going to be a very good day for the Republican Party, based off of nothing other than what we call, you know, fundamentals, which is looking at the economy, looking at the president, the party in power's approval rating, and just the fact that there's always a little bit of a pullback 2 years after a party takes power. Voters usually want some checks and balances. So with all that, you know, the president's approval rating in the 30s, the economy, you know, we can debate, you know, what metrics to use to say whether or not the economy is in decent shape or is in poor shape. Obviously, inflation and gas prices also drive that conversation. Everything was kind of working against President Biden and the Democratic Party nationally and here in Harrisburg. We would have expected that a red wave would have hit and significant gains in both the House and the Senate for the Republican Party. And we'll talk about what exactly happened and why. So as I just mentioned, key issues for 2022, you know, what was driving voter decisions, what were candidates talking about, what they thought was driving voter decisions. Number 1 was reproductive rights, reproductive freedom. The Dobbs decision on Roe v. Wade that occurred on June 24th really did upend the midterm election. In fact, if you look at polling data, you can actually see that prior to June 24th, the Republican Party on a generic congressional ballot, and that's what we use to see which party, which messaging is actually working better for the American public. Republicans were ahead in the congressional generic ballot from the beginning of the year through June 24th. After the Dobbs decision came down, you can see that Democrats, you know, almost immediately tied Republicans on the generic ballot, and then frankly, were ahead most of the summer, and they were really duking it out, maybe 1 or 2 points each way, depending on what poll you were looking at, between, Labor Day and Election Day. So obviously reproductive freedom was I believe, the number one issue driving voter turnout, which did impact our results and why we did or didn't get that red wave. And we'll talk about that in a second. But, second to reproductive freedom, I would say, is the economy, inflation, and gas prices. We're all paying more at the pump. We're all paying more at the grocery store. The economy, and those two factors do factor into whether or not we feel that we have a strong, successful economy and we're headed in the right direction. Inflation and gas prices, despite the jobs numbers being positive, Americans, if they're not feeling it in their everyday lives, which is, going to the grocery store, how much are you paying for a gallon of milk? Are we paying $4 or $5 a gallon for a tank of gas? Those are the issues that everyday Americans ultimately pay attention to and decide which party they think, it goes into the economic mood of the country, which is a heavy factor when we go cast our ballot. Do we feel comfortable? Do we feel secure in our economic safety net or not? That drives a lot of voter decision making, as does crime and public safety. And we've seen a lot, no matter where you are, crime seems to be a heavy topic in every community. In Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs was a major subject. A lot of political ad making was centered around the city of Philadelphia and the uptick in crime that's been experienced in that area. But we saw it across the country, whether you were in Philadelphia, whether you were in New Hampshire, whether you were in Oregon. Crime was a top issue that voters were making decisions on which party would be best to solve those problems. Additionally, COVID-19 pandemic response. We're still dealing with the pandemic and its remnants, and this is the first national election that we as voters have had the opportunity to judge our elected officials, both in Harrisburg and in Washington, D.C., based off of our view of the pandemic response. You could argue in 2020, you could make those decisions as well, but we are still really in the thick of the pandemic. Obviously, COVID still exists. It's still around us. It's still, we still have to, take the precautions in our buildings to ensure that we keep case counts low. But by and large, we're open. Our government, our economy is open. Folks are back to their regular activities, and so now voters are looking back and saying, was it right to have our schools closed? Was it right to shut down our economy? Did we open too quickly? Did we open, were we were too late to the game? So voters were looking back and deciding, which party really handled the pandemic response the best, and that was still a lingering factor in voter decision making. And of course, immigration, to a lesser extent, I would say it's definitely the least of issues that voters voted on, unless you're probably around the southern border, maybe it was a little bit higher. But up here in Pennsylvania, immigration, was a factor, but generally speaking, not one of the top tier issues that voters were going to the ballot box and voting on that issue. So without further ado, and after we just kind of set the page for what was on our ballots and what the issues were, I do want to talk now about the results of the election, both here in Harrisburg and in Washington, and talk about the impact moving forward on our sector. So as you all know, Governor of Pennsylvania, we have State Senator Doug Mastriano of Franklin County was the Republican nominee, winning a 9-way primary back in May, and winning the nomination and carrying the Republican banner into the fall. He's at the top of the ticket, and then you have Attorney General Josh Shapiro, who ran unopposed. AG Shapiro, this was something that he was pursuing. It wasn't a secret that he was going to seek the nomination in 2022, ultimately have the blessing of the Democratic Party, and head into November, leading his party at the top of the ticket for governor. So these were the two candidates. Again, we have a state senator, a very conservative state senator, and our chief law enforcement officer, Josh Shapiro, on the Democratic side. Those two faced off. And ultimately, as we all know by now, Pennsylvania elected Josh Shapiro governor. He is now the governor-elect. And, just looking at the election results here, the polling was pretty consistent that this race wasn't much of a contest after the primary. A lot of that, a lot of the reasoning there was frankly a money issue on the Republican Mastriano campaign part. Josh Shapiro raised a record amount of money for this race. I think he raised the most money of any non-incumbent candidate for governor and spent the most of any non-incumbent governor to win this election. At times, I believe the Shapiro campaign was outspending the Mastriano campaign upwards of 100 to 200 to 1 in terms of ads, both on TV, online, digital. Made it very difficult for Doug Mastriano after winning a very bruising primary where he had to spend a lot of money, comes out of that primary, frankly, with no resources, a very divided party, and he's facing off immediately with a attorney general who's got supreme name ID because he's been on our tickets 2 times now for statewide office. And oh, by the way, he ran unopposed, so he just started banking his war chest. Waking up the day after the primary, Josh Shapiro had $20 million in the bank. Doug Mastriano had $0. So as you can see, there were a lot of factors that played into why Shapiro was able to cruise to election. Obviously, money is a factor. When you have money, you're able to paint your opponent any which way you'd like. And unfortunately for Doug Mastriano, there was a lot of material. There were a lot of clips of things that he'd said on predominantly social issues that were used by the Shapiro campaign over and over and over again over the summer and into the fall that went unanswered by the Mastriano campaign and really helped to paint Doug Mastriano as somebody who is out of touch, frankly, for voters of Pennsylvania. And obviously, everyone on this webinar can agree or disagree. And ultimately speaking, we can see that the voters made that decision, and clearly the Shapiro strategy worked, receiving the most votes of any non-incumbent in the history of Pennsylvania. That 2,993,747 number actually just increased. He's now over 3 million votes. I think actually now he received the most votes, frankly, of any candidate, whether you're an incumbent or not, for governor. So truly a historic victory for the Shapiro campaign. And, talking a little bit now about what a Governor-elect Shapiro, a future Shapiro administration means for long-term care, PHCA, and our members. So just as a side note, reading the tea leaves, looking at the polling, looking at which candidate was raising more money and was ultimately probably going to be the most successful, we made the determination, after the primary and through the summer to essentially go all in on Josh Shapiro. And that decision was because we were looking at the Mastriano campaign, noticing that, they were struggling to raise money and gain traction, and really ultimately thought that it would be an uphill battle for Senator Mastriano to win this election. And you always want to ride with the winner, right? And, PHCA since January of this year knew that A.G. Shapiro at the very least would be the nominee, but was still, a 50-50 shot of being elected governor, depending on who the Republicans nominated. Well, after the primary, that kind of went to 80-20 in favor of A.G. Shapiro. So we went all in. Our members, our business partners, long-term care aligned organizations contributed nearly $200,000 to the Shapiro campaign, held multiple events with the Attorney General, have a lot of FaceTime with him and his team. And I know that that did not go unnoticed. So that's a benefit for us moving forward, at having been there early and often being an ally to the governor-elect and his folks. So I think that will ultimately lead to success for us in terms of having a seat at the table, and we can talk about that shortly. I did also want to note that PHCA was the largest long-term care contributor to the Shapiro campaign, and among the top advocacy organizations across all industries, all sectors, in donating to the governor-elect. I believe we even, I know it says long-term care, but even from the healthcare continuum at large, looking at, let's say, hospitals, I think we still out-contributed those folks as well. So obviously we've been noticed, we have been noticed for our large fundraising prowess and our ability to contribute large sums of money, which helps ultimately. Pennsylvania is a pay-to-play state and helps gain access. Doesn't guarantee issues that we're fighting for get accomplished, but at least gets us in the door, which is obviously the first step. So what's next for the governor-elect? Actually, yesterday he and his lieutenant governor-elect had a press conference with Governor Wolf to talk about the transition, which begins immediately, laying out their transition team. Governor-elect gets sworn in on January 17th. He'll resign as Attorney General that day, be sworn in as our governor. And, you know, in terms of the transition, we know that PHCA will play a role, whether it's somebody on our staff or one of our members. You know, we will have representation on the transition teams, specifically in healthcare policy. And what that really means is we'll review the transition memos left behind from the Wolf administration on the current issues they're working on, regulatory or pursuing legislatively regarding our sector, and we'll have the ability to provide input in terms of what the incoming administration should be doing, whether they should continue on the same track or perhaps change policy course. So again, we're looking forward to being a part of that transition and helping guide the early days of a Shapiro administration. We're also hopeful that through that transition process, we will have input on the appointments of key cabinet secretaries, obviously in our sector, that Secretary of Health, that Secretary of Human Services, and to a lesser extent, the Secretary of Budget. The Budget Secretary really plays a large role, you know, from May to June when we're trying to fight for our funding priorities. They have to have a good understanding of our issues. So those three are the three cabinet secretaries that we're going to be focusing on, but primarily Health and Human Services. Who are the nominees? What background do they have in long-term care and their ability to actually understand our issues and be a positive force moving forward over the next 4 years to really help build long-term care in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, finally, the governor-elect's first budget address will be on March the 7th, about a month later than usual, where he will outline his budget priorities for the June 2023 state budget. Obviously, you know, we've been very successful over the last few budget cycles of getting funding. So this will be key for us to, you know, not only see what his legislative priorities, his funding priorities are going to be, but opportunities to ensure that we're a part of it. You know, for the last 8 years under the Wolf administration, by and large, we were left out of any budget proposal that the administration put forth to the General Assembly. It is our hope that moving forward, our funding initiatives might find its way in the governor's proposal. So it's not just PHCA and our long-term care allies starting from scratch, you know, having to go to both the General Assembly and the governor to convince them that you need to fund us. At least if we can start day one in a governor's budget address and play some defense to ensure that funding that the governor-elect puts forth actually remains in place, and it just increases the likelihood of our funding success moving forward. So we're going to be playing a large role in trying to get the Shapiro administration to actually include us in budgets this year and years to come. The battle for the Pennsylvania State Senate, and you'll see it's a Republican win, we'll say, and that's because they held on to the chamber. As I mentioned, they had 29 seats going into the election. Every incumbent in both parties won their seats and defended their open seats. That's you know, any senator that retired, the party in which currently held the seat, the person that was running to replace the exiting senator of the same party was elected. So by and large, we have stability in the state Senate. Legislative redistricting did create a new district in the Lehigh Valley that skews more Democratic, and Senator-elect Nick Miller, school board president in Allentown, he defeated his Republican opponent, so the Democrats actually do pick up a seat. So it goes from 29 to 21 down to 28 to 22. Republicans still control the chamber. And that's good news for PHCA, frankly. You know, we forged really strong relationships with Republican Senate leadership over the last 4 years. specifically Senator Kim Ward, who was the majority leader for the 2021-22 legislative session. That's a key position. She actually got promoted and was elected by her colleagues just the other day. She's the first female Senate president in the history of the Commonwealth. So she is number one. She is in control of that chamber. Again, a strong PHCA ally, really understands our issues, and frankly, from our perspective, we couldn't think of anybody better in that role for us moving forward, leading the state Senate. Joe Pittman is the new majority leader. Senator Pittman is in his first term. He is from Indiana County, a staffer by trade. He worked prior to being elected to the state Senate. He was chief of staff to the senator in the district in which he represents. And that's beneficial because he really understands advocacy. He really understands what we do from a lobbying perspective, from an advocacy perspective, grassroots, and he really understands the issues because he's had to advise his former boss of those issues day to day. So now he's in the Senate, and now he's the second in charge of the Republican caucus. In advance of this vote, frankly, PHCA. We were very deliberate in trying to predict and get ahead of who would take over for Kim Ward as majority leader. And this entire summer and into the fall, we have been front and center in front of the new majority leader at events, at breakfasts, at dinners, at lunches. We've held a fundraiser for him out in his district. We have a very good relationship with the majority leader, and it's growing. So we're very happy that he's in his role. And then we have a new appropriations chairman, Scott Martin of Lancaster County, another really good PHCA relationship, somebody I know that we can work with, who I think also understands our issues and is willing to allocate resources for the most vulnerable Pennsylvanians. And I think that these three folks being at the top of Republican Senate leadership is actually even better than what we had over the last 2 to 4 years. So very positive. On the Democratic side, minority leader Jay Costa reelected into his role. A very good relationship with the minority leader, and Vince Hughes from Philadelphia County. He's the minority appropriations chairman as well. So all 5 folks you see here, I'm not just saying this, PHCA has developed and continues to forge a very strong relationship with these 5 individuals. These are the 5 folks who ultimately decide our legislative agenda and our budget agenda, whether or not it goes forward or stays put. So we're very happy with the outcome of Senate leadership elections this year. The battle for the state house is, we're going to still call it too close to call. Democrats gained 11 seats, Republicans lost 11 seats, obviously. The Democratic gains were mainly in the Philadelphia suburbs, Pittsburgh, and in suburban Harrisburg. There are still 2 seats that are too close to call. In Bucks County, the Republican down there is leading his Democratic challenger by 114 votes. This is an open seat. In the 151st district in Montgomery County, incumbent Todd Stevens trails his opponent by 37 votes. We expect that these 2 races will by and large be wrapped up by tomorrow once both county board of elections go through provisional ballots. So hoping to have more clarity tomorrow. We do feel confident, though, ultimately the Republicans will win the 142nd, the Democrats will win the 151st, and that will make the majority in Harrisburg for the first time in over a decade in favor of the Democratic Party by 1 seat. 102 to 101 once all members are seated. So that's a big change over what we've been dealing with over the last 8 years with Republican dominance in the General Assembly and a Democratic governor. So a little bit of this might get a little bit too in the weeds, but some of you might find this fascinating. I certainly do. The problem with the state house and how it will be configured, at least in the beginning, is that 3 Democrats that got elected to the General Assembly, 2 of them are incumbents. Actually, all 3 of them are technically incumbents. 2 are running for re-election. the problem we have is that Representative Summerlee was elected to Congress, Representative Austin Davis was elected lieutenant governor, and Representative Tony DeLuca actually unfortunately passed away last month. Because he passed away in October, it was too late to remove him from the ballot. It's a heavy Democratic district. He ultimately got reelected even though he had passed away. So the issue at hand is, Democrats will have probably a 102, 101 majority once all members are seated, but because Representative DeLuca has passed away, it's now 101, 101. A majority is needed to elect a new Speaker of the House. We're not quite sure who's going to blink first because we're tied. And even after we elect a Speaker of the House, Representative Lee and Davis have to resign to assume their new offices in Congress or as the Lieutenant Governor, and the DeLuca seat's not going to be filled. So at least for the first few months of next session, despite Democrats winning the most seats at 102, Republicans will likely control the House 101-99 until we can have special elections to fill those seats. And speaking about, just briefly on that Speaker election, it's tied. The Speaker of the House actually sets the date of special election. So until we can get a Speaker, we can't have a date set to replace those 3 seats, which means the Republicans will operate in the majority for an undetermined amount of time, likely maximum amount until May 2023, the primary election. Again, who will the Speaker be? Brian Cutler is the current Republican Speaker of the House. There's pathways for him to possibly be reelected temporarily. Joanna McClinton is the current House Minority Leader. The Democrats have already signaled that once they take the chamber, that she will be elected Speaker of the House. Again, 101, 101. Do we look at these 2 folks and say, okay, you know what, we're gonna, neither of them have neither of them have the majority of votes to be elected Speaker. Is there a compromise choice temporarily that is put in place just to get us through a couple of months? And ultimately speaking, when the Democrats fill those 3 seats, Joanna McClinton will once again be elected Speaker of the House. So very interesting dynamics going on in Harrisburg. It certainly makes our lives a little bit more complicated in terms of preparing for next session, both from a legislative preparation and a political preparation. Not knowing who's going to control the chamber and when certainly makes things a little bit more interesting around here. I do want to turn to Washington, D.C. This is certainly from a national perspective, the most interesting and most focused upon race in the United States. And that's because you have 2 very interesting personalities. If you would have told me this time last year that Dr. Oz would have been the Republican nominee for Senate, I would have just laughed, actually. I wouldn't have said anything. I wouldn't have been able to say anything because I would have been shocked. But nevertheless, he won a very crowded Republican primary. Thanks to former President Trump and his endorsement, Oz was very narrowly able to win the Republican primary and be the party nominee in November. And then, of course, our Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman, he won a 4-way primary and ultimately was the Democratic choice for Senate. Obviously, by now, we all see that John Fetterman was elected our U.S. Senator. You'll see down here, it's a switch. That means, obviously, Senator Toomey was a Republican. Senator-elect Fetterman is a Democrat, so the Democrats netted out 1 seat with flipping Pennsylvania. And you can see the Senate results here. Obviously, very interesting. Democrats won both statewide contests, but they won them differently. Obviously, A.G. Shapiro outran Fetterman by about 6 points, but nevertheless, the Fetterman campaign was able to hold down typically Republican super majorities in the rural areas of Pennsylvania, and was able to outrun the Biden campaign from 2020, and that's why he was elected. It's not just Philadelphia and the suburbs and Pittsburgh. Frankly, the votes were pretty much the same from 2020. It was really the rural areas where there was some erosion with Dr. Oz, and that allowed Senator-elect Fetterman to win the campaign. Again, issues in this race, economy, crime, inflation, plus you have the on the Democratic side, making the argument that Dr. Oz is not from Pennsylvania, that he's from New Jersey, and on the Oz side, making the argument that Senator-elect Fetterman wasn't up to the challenge following his stroke back in May, and what his recovery looks like. Ultimately, the voters decided that he is capable of serving, and elected John Fetterman to represent us for the next 6 years. Battle for the U.S. Senate. We can say now that the Democrats will hold on to that chamber. They will do so by flipping Pennsylvania, picking up that seat, and successfully fending off tough challenges of their incumbents in Arizona, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Republicans were able to hold strong in Wisconsin and North Carolina. And again, because Senator-elect Fetterman won his race here in Pennsylvania, we can say definitively, despite the fact that we have to go through a runoff election in December to determine who will be the senator from Georgia, either the incumbent Raphael Warnock or Herschel Walker. It doesn't matter who wins there, ultimately speaking, because Vice President Harris is the tiebreaker, that Democrats will control the majority in the U.S. Senate. And you can just see there the map, very consistent, pretty regionalized as well. I know it says 48 up here, but you have to account for Senator Sanders of Vermont and Senator Angus King of Maine. Both are independents, but they caucus with the Democrats, so that's how they get the full 50. The battle for the House, this actually says likely Republican win. It's some networks have called it, but others have not. The Associated Press has not. Very, very likely that Republicans, when all the votes are cast, will have at least 218 seats to have the majority. They will retake the U.S. House of Representatives, which means we'll have divided government down in Washington, going from that uniform Democratic control of the executive branch, the Senate, and the House. Obviously the Democrats still have President Biden. They still control the Senate, but they will no longer control the House. So the Republicans in the House will be able to, make some headway with their legislative priorities. And ultimately speaking, moving forward, for anything to get done on our issues, or frankly any issue, you're going to need to negotiate with the Republicans in the House to get anything through. So that's either going to bring compromise or just gridlock. Those are the two options. I'm hoping it breeds compromise, but obviously over the last several years we've seen that that's a dirty word, and we're not sure what the mood of both leaders in the House and the Senate will be to negotiate with the Biden administration to get things done. Here in Pennsylvania, obviously we have 17 seats, but only 4 were really competitive. The Democrats held all 4 of those competitive seats going into the election. Coming out of the election, they won all 4. So Summerlee and Chris DeLuzio out in Allegheny County, they're representing the greater Pittsburgh area. They held on to their seats. Congresswoman Susan Wild in the Lehigh Valley and Congressman Matt Cartwright from the Scranton area. Tough races, tough re-elects, but they ultimately hung on, and that helps, helped the Democrats stave off, larger losses in the U.S. House. So despite winning the House, because the Republicans weren't successful in these races in Pennsylvania and frankly across the country, their majority is only going to be in the single digits, much less than the expectation that they might, net out 20 to 30 seats. I think they might only net out 10. And there's the map. Obviously, we're not done yet. We're still filling in, and you can see where parties are getting their majorities from. So it'll be very interesting to see, how the final results shake out. Anything obviously more than 218 is ideal for Republicans because they have the majority. But there's a difference of having a 3-seat majority to a 15-seat majority. Certainly makes it more difficult for the Republicans to keep all of their members in line to be able to move their legislative agenda. So I found this online. I thought it was kind of funny, and it really was just, we started the presentation with that red wave, lurking over President Biden. And as it turns out, the red wave didn't really materialize. While Republicans did win back the House, they didn't necessarily meet their expectations of retaking the Senate and winning overwhelming majorities in the U.S. House. Not to mention, looking away from what happened in Washington, D.C., the Democrats are likely to take the House here in Pennsylvania. State houses in Michigan and Minnesota flipped from Republican to Democrat. So we didn't really see that red wave materialize. And it's the first time since 2002 when George W. Bush was in his first term with high approval ratings, did the party in power not really suffer the wrath of the voters. So a little bit different in 2002, George W. Bush had like a 60% approval rating. So it made sense that the red wave, the blue wave on the Democratic side didn't materialize. This was a little bit different because the Biden numbers, regardless of your opinion of him, his approval ratings are somewhere in the 30s. The economy is kind of teetering, and the expectation, all the fundamentals, you look at elections over the last 100 years, it really, everything would have pointed to the Republicans having a wave election and really dominating both chambers of government, but that ultimately did not happen. And so you ask yourself why. I'll only speak to Pennsylvania, and our exit polls here in Pennsylvania showed that abortion was the #1 issue that mattered most to people who voted, and that's shows why Attorney General Shapiro was able to dominate his race for governor and John Fetterman for U.S. Senate. It's also a huge reason why Democrats retook the state house. For lack of better terms, the Democrats really made this election about abortion being on the ballot here in Pennsylvania. That resonated with voters. And obviously, again, that was the top issue that people said they were going to vote on. Inflation and economy was certainly #2, close behind, along with crime and guns, and then immigration. So I think looking at these numbers, they don't match up to the fundamentals needed to have that red wave. So again, what happened? I can tell you what happened. Youth turnout was soaring, almost on par with the 2020 presidential election. That does not happen in midterm elections, generally speaking. Young voters do not traditionally participate at the levels that they participate in the presidential. They came out, and that certainly helped the Democratic Party. There's discussion about candidate quality on both sides. Our party's putting out the best people who are talking about the issues and solutions, as opposed to being lightning rods on social media. The American public was very clear this year that they were looking for folks who were actually going to solve issues, who were talking about real issues that impacted them. And the candidates that did that, on the Republican side especially, won their races. And the Democrats had their own challenges with folks just being lightning rods and very partisan and struggling to win, looking up into the state of New York. Republicans did very well up there, and you can talk about candidate quality. I think there was a difference there. Legislative redistricting, again, constitutionally required every 10 years. This was the first election that we were running in new lines. Here in Pennsylvania, the Democrats had a slight advantage in controlling the process. Going into this year, we thought the results of the new lines would yield good results for Republicans keeping control of the Senate. But the state house was going to be a coin flip, and the lines in the state house were actually designed to only have to allow one party, to have a maximum majority of maybe 105 to 107 seats, skewed a little bit more Democratic, but certainly was a shock that after all votes are cast, the Democrats are going to be able to retake the majority. So I think we're going to be deadlocked, with a slim majority either way moving forward, which is going to either require these folks in Harrisburg to compromise, or we're going to have gridlock. And then the Dobbs decision again, I think that certainly changed the trajectory of this election. Getting back up to bullet #1 drove the millennial and Gen Z turnout, and that's ultimately why Republicans didn't have as good of a night as they had hoped. So what now? Just majorities in both chambers, of the House in Harrisburg and Washington. There's no clear path for who's going to be the speaker here in Harrisburg. Down in Washington, it's the same thing with a slim Republican majority. Within that majority, there's, you have your moderates, you have your conservatives, and then you have your ultra conservatives. And Democrats have the same issue with the progressives and the left as well. But because you have those factions, the question is, can the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. stay together and elect a Speaker of the House? And the same thing here in Harrisburg. It only takes one person to change parties and give the control back to the Republicans. So that's something that we're monitoring. We have to navigate divided government in Harrisburg and Washington, as we have, at least in Harrisburg, over the last 8 years. Washington is a return, after a 2-year hiatus of unified government, we're back to divided government. And we know we're going to have to play offense and defense with divided government. So what does our agenda look like moving forward? Obviously, state budget is still, top priority number one for us. The regs were implemented by the Regulatory Commission last month. Those increased staffing ratios are going to be in place starting July 1. The funding that we secured through the state budget process, certainly it will go a long way to making those staffing ratios attainable. But we're certainly not done yet. We still need additional investments in Medicaid to catch up and really solidify the long-term care sector in Pennsylvania. So we'll be coming with another Medicaid increase this year. Additionally, with the remaining ARPA funds, if there's any left over, looking at workforce training, recruitment and retention. Workforce, aside from funding, is our top issue that we've been hearing about for our members. The more funding, the more tools that long-term care has to recruit and retain folks to our sector, the better it is for us to build that workforce. So those are two funding priorities that we're looking at as we build our budget ask for 2023. And as that ask gets built out and finalized, obviously we'll be sharing with our members, as we have in the past, to really start talking to your lawmakers about the need to fund long-term care. From a legislative perspective, regulatory perspective, we're also looking at, from a workforce perspective, personal care attendant, certified med techs, improving career pathways, looking at modernizing positions in long-term care, the PCA really being the new entry point, on-the-job training, almost like an apprenticeship program. You get hired as a PCA, you do on-the-job training as you're going through your in-person skills training, and you can do your online assessment either in the facility or at home after you work, providing that direct care to residents. This is something that we're looking at, basically taking the TNA program and making it permanent with a little bit more training requirements. That's something that we're hoping to accomplish. Ideally, this program, just like the med techs that we'll talk about in a second, they ultimately will need regs from the Department of Health and working with the Department of Education as well to set up regs to train these folks what they can and cannot do. So that's something that we're looking at moving into 2023. Also, certified med techs. Other states have these med techs. It's essentially it's an add-on to your CNA license. After a certain period of time being a licensed CNA, you can do a training course and be licensed to pass some meds. And obviously with the LPN shortage that I know everyone's facing in their facilities, this is probably the best way to overcome that obstacle. And again, will require regs. So the question is, will a new Shapiro administration, a Shapiro Department of Health, Department of Education, will they work with us on doing the PCA and the CMT without having to do legislation and tell them to do it? Will they do it willingly or not? That's something that we're certainly going to be having conversations with those folks once they get in place to see what the path of least resistance to get these things moving will be. And then, of course, finally, Medicaid and assisted living. We were, we've been fighting this fight for a long time. In this session, we actually had a committee vote, the furthest along it's ever gotten. So, looking to make that front and center in 2023 and beyond to eventually, hopefully, get Medicaid authorized in assisted living residences. Continuation of our legislative agenda. Some of this is actually more regulatory, but obviously now that the regulations have been passed along by IRC, those have to be implemented, and that's going to take a lot of work to make sure they're implemented properly. We have to focus on getting AL regulations done, and what does that look like? Making sure that the Medicaid payments, the increased MA rates, get passed through the managed care organizations and in the hands of the providers. So holding DHS accountable and making sure that those payments go out on time, and they obviously are not holding anything back on our facilities. And then the implementation of our staffing agency legislation that just was signed into law 2 weeks ago. There's going to be some new requirements on agencies and how they operate. They're going to have to now register with the Department of Health, and as you can see, within 180 days of the law being signed, which was, I guess, about 2 weeks ago, staffing agencies who were already operating in the Commonwealth have to register with DOH. Any staffing agency that sprung up after the bill was signed into law has 90 days to work with DOH. This is going to require regs on DOH's part too to fully implement the statute and the complaint process. So, obviously we're going to need to be patient with the department on their implementation of the staffing agency statute, but obviously we're thrilled that we were able to get this done on the last day of session through the Senate and get the governor to sign it, because it's certainly going to be very instrumental in hopefully curbing some of the negative practices that our facilities are seeing from staffing agencies. We're also going to have to play defense, especially now with a House that's controlled by the Democrats. Tort reform on our end is kind of out the window, but we got to make sure that everything stays at least status quo. So all the whether it be liability, all that good stuff. Have to make sure that the trial lawyers are in check and that nothing detrimental happens because we have a Democratic governor, we have a Democratic House. We'll rely on the state Senate to really be the backstop to ensure that status quo on these issues remain in place. Democrats have, the last couple of sessions have introduced false claims act legislation. We'll have to take that on in the House if that comes about. The Patient Safety Act, which is predominantly, deals with hospitals, similar to our nurse regs on increased staffing. That's what the Patient Safety Act is. Again, focusing on hospitals, but there is language in there that would require a 1-to-5 RN to patient ratio in skilled nursing facilities at all times. Obviously, the folks in this webinar realize that is way out of line for how we operate, very out of touch. Our folks have done the numbers, and we would need an additional 45,000 RNs to implement a 1-to-5. And, frankly, where are we getting those folks? It just would be completely unattainable. So we'll have to play defense there, especially in the House, to get that language removed from the Patient Safety Act in its entirety. And I think we have the advocacy prowess to do that. So something we're monitoring. And then of course, always just defending unfunded mandates, any additional regulations or statutes that come along that provide additional oversight and requirements on providers that aren't being paid out by the state government, by the federal government. We're going to continue to fight. And in closing, I did just want to talk about one final the key component that makes this association work and why we've been successful over the last few years is advocacy. Our grassroots advocacy. It's not just our lobbying efforts here in Harrisburg with myself, with Zach, with our communications team, with our regs team, with our external lobbyists. We do play a large role, but lawmakers really do prefer to hear from folks on the ground in their district. It's always beneficial when the more participation we have from folks on this call and beyond to highlight the challenges we're seeing in our facilities and the changes that we need. That's what builds good public policy and makes our lives a lot easier. Advocacy strategies, as we've talked about this before, going in person in meetings. Zoom meetings are now the probably in some cases the easiest both for you and the lawmaker. I know it's difficult to get away from buildings because of the staffing crisis, but setting up a Zoom or a phone call, still reading those letters work as well, email, touching base on social media, all ways to really get in front of lawmakers and present the facts, the challenges that you're seeing real time in your facilities, ultimately gets lawmakers to move in our direction. And again, just in terms of communications, we just ran through it. These are all really good strategies to get involved. Some are more time sensitive, or some are more entail a little bit more time than others. But encouraging you to continue to communicate with your lawmakers. Welcoming lawmakers into your facility, especially now as the restrictions have kind of eased from COVID. We have 40 new members of the General Assembly. It's not just folks who got defeated, but there were a bunch of legislative retirements. We have, that's 40 new freshmen who are going to be voting on legislation that positively and negatively impacts us. State budget funding that positively or negatively impacts us. We got to educate these folks and get them up to speed as soon as possible. So if you know that you're in an area where you're going to have a new state house member, a new state senator, a new member of Congress, and you want to set something up, I encourage you, give them some time in the first part of the new year once they take office and get their office set up. But let's get them in, and I'm happy to facilitate those requests and arrange those meetings. Just please let me know. But I encourage everyone just to take a look and make sure that your House, Senate, and U.S. House Congressperson all got reelected. If they did not, if it's somebody new, let's make plans to talk to them in the new year. And again, scheduling virtual meetings. This was from our virtual congressional briefing last year. Very successful. It certainly is a good tool to engage lawmakers and staff easily from the comforts of your own facilities or your house. Rally Day, we did a kind of a pared down rally day in 2022, but still made sure folks knew we were in the building. We're going to be doing that again this year, or I'm sorry, in 2023. So be on the lookout. Visiting folks in Harrisburg in their offices, just bringing our issues to their attention. Boots on the ground is certainly one way to push forward our agenda. Things to remember, of course, this is for a lot of you, this is probably repetitive, but making sure you introduce yourself to the legislator and to staff. Just as a note, over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten a lot of staff inquiries about facilities and trying to get in touch regarding constituent issues or just questions about long-term care. The faster you can establish relationships with your legislator and their staff, they're going to call you directly, and those relationships will be will be built upon and be positive. So encourage you to reach out in any way possible. And just one final note, just on advocacy. Obviously we're doing something right, because in this legislative session, take a look at everything you've accomplished. 17.5% Medicaid increase for nursing homes, $378 million over the last few years in ARPA to SNFs, nearly $60 million for ALPC, $20 million for SSI, the continuation of MDOI, the HVAC program that our members by and large took advantage of. That's a lot of new funding that would not have been obtained without your efforts, and we're looking forward to continuing our budgetary success going into 2023. And then from a legislative perspective, we talked about the staffing agency bill. That was a labor of love. We had a compromise. We've really had to talk to both parties about getting this done and making sure it was in a good position. A lot of information from our members helped guide the legislation and build the story as to why we need to rein in staffing agencies, and so that's a credit to you all. The nurse licensure compact was done in 2021. I know we've gotten a lot of questions about when that's going to be fully implemented. It's not a state issue at this point. It's a federal issue. The FBI is holding up the implementation of the nurse licensure compact, so we'll keep you updated when that officially comes online. I know folks, especially from border Maryland and New Jersey and New York and Ohio, you're along the border of other states, you're certainly looking for the NLC to help your workforce crisis. Blended CNA learning is still something that we're waiting for regs from the Department of Education, but was passed in 2021, making it a little bit more easy for folks to complete online training or training for it to be a CNA, at least the educational components online. And then finally, MA for AL, we were able to get done through the State Senate Health and Human Services Committee, where it eventually died. That is some momentum, and we'll certainly be looking forward to reintroducing that bill and furthering it in the next legislative session. So again, everything that is on this slide would be good accomplished over 5 years, but the fact that we've done it in about 2 really speaks to our strong advocacy efforts. And I don't think there's a association, an organization outside of PHCA that can show these types of victories. So again, congratulations for getting all of this done. Just a note on advocacy events that we're doing moving forward. We're gonna have a freshman legislative breakfast and policy summit in February, where we're gonna start training those new freshman lawmakers on our issues. We're gonna have a legislative conference and rally day in May. And of course, our PHCA fundraising events for lawmakers in leadership will occur all year. So it'll be a busy 2023 as we work to get up to speed with our new state government, our new government in Washington, D.C. But looking forward to it, looking forward to working with all of you to continue the momentum that we've seen. And with that, I know we're a little bit over on time. Obviously you can connect with us on Twitter and Facebook. Our president and CEO, Zach Schamberg, is always accessible via email, Twitter, Facebook, as am I. But I do want to pause and see, Kim, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions. I did put a reminder in the chat that if anyone has any questions, please utilize the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And I'm not seeing any questions at this moment. Please feel free to reach out to Tim or myself via email, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have after today's session.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tim. Bye.